Hi everyone, it's Rich. So what we want to do now is we've added our Recaptcha box to our registration form, but now we need to process the response that we get back from Google to decide whether the person filling out our form is human or not. So on our register page, it looks like this. We've used the client key that we generated that we got from Recaptcha. I've posted that key on Blackboard. It works with the computer studies domain. It will also work if you're on your local host, although it will print a little message in red down here that just says running on localhost. So that's one half of the battle. We've got this CAPTCHA displaying. The problem is right now it doesn't do any validation. We can register even without checking off the I'm not a robot box. So we need to go back to the Recaptcha documentation in order to look at how this works. So on the main Recaptcha site, if I go into resources, we get into the documentation here. They've got under guide, they tell us how this works. Now, one limit with the documentation, we're using version 2, but their documentation actually still is more fleshed out for version 1. So for example, we can see a full code sample with how to use version 1 of the API. Now it tells us, notice this is an old version, where we get full code sample in PHP how we do this. For some reason, Google hasn't provided us the same kind of code samples for version 2. So we're going to have to go through that. Be a good thing for somebody to actually write would be the documentation for version 2. So we're going to need to open up our save registration page. You know, we've done this part. We're getting started. So it says by default keys will always work on localhost or 127 as well as our domain. So this tells us, you know, how do we display the widget? This is the part we've already done. So we make a call to the API JavaScript file, and the JavaScript renders back this box for us. So there's some other issues there. So now let's look at what we do, some other options in terms of how we verify the user's response. So what we're going to get back, we're going to make, here's what's going to happen. We're going to make a request to google.com to this URL, API/site verify. We're going to do a post here. We're going to send in our secret key that validates that we're on the same domain as on our public key, our client ID. And we will get back we're also going to send in the response. So this is generated automatically by the API. So basically that tells Google whether the user correctly identified themselves, yes or no. And what we get back is a JSON object. So JSON, some of you might be familiar with, we're going to work with it a lot more in later classes, is JavaScript object notation. It's basically a JavaScript array of key value pairs. So what we're going to get back from the API is an array. The first key will be success with a value of true or false. We'll get back a timestamp and the host name. We're really only interested, and then if success evaluates to false, we're going to get back some error codes. So for example, if we don't put in a client secret, we're going to get an error code that says missing input secret. If we don't send in a response, we will get back a missing input response. So JSON has become the internet standard for APIs for basically we can generate a JSON object with pretty much any kind of programming language. It doesn't matter if we're building in PHP and the Google API is written in Node.js or ASP.NET, it doesn't matter. All frameworks can pass JSON. Now, in the past, the standard format for APIs has been XML, which some of you may have seen. JSON tends to be newer. It's easier to read, it's more lightweight, requires less bandwidth, so it transfers data faster. So this is what we're going to use. So we're going to want to open up our save registration page. And maybe after we validate our regular inputs, username, that we get a username and password, but before we save to the database, let's start validating the Recaptcha. So if we want to make a post to to the Google server, we don't want to take the user off to that page, yet we need to still submit this data off to Google. So we need to think about how we're going to do this. First, we'll set up a couple variables, one called secret, and I'm going to paste in my secret key. Can't get into Blackboard at the moment, but I have my secret key elsewhere. So I'm just going to grab it from another file. You can grab it off of Blackboard. I have our secret key here, so that's the same value we have on Blackboard. I'm just going to copy that, paste it in. I'm also going to set up a variable called response, because these are the two things we're going to need to send to Google. So where do we get this? We're going to get this value from the API generates a field that if we look in the documentation will be G-Recaptcha-response. So that's where we need to get from our post collection Recaptcha. So this will tell us what the user chose. The next thing we want to do is we need to set up a post request to go to the Google API, but what we don't want to do is actually take this page. We want to do a hidden post in the background. So there's a PHP function called curl, C-U-R-L, that will allow us to make a remote call to another website without actually transferring the URL in our browser. So what we're going to do is set up URL request. And create a variable called ch, stands for my curl request. And the first thing we need to do is call curl init. So we're going to initialize the curl command. Curl works on the command prompt as well. For example, if we want to make a call to a URL and see what kind of response we get back, we can actually do this from the command prompt or terminal on a Mac. Next thing we want to do is we need to set the option. So there's a function built in, and you can see my code editor recognize it, called set option. So the first thing we want to do is say with our curl handler, we're going to set the URL. So this is the page we are going to call, and we're going to set this value equal to, this comes straight from the Google API docs. We're going to go to google.com/recaptcha/API site verify. This is the URL we want to invoke that will tell us whether our CAPTCHA code is any good or not. Whoops, and I missed a closing bracket because it's the parameter of a function call. Again, if we go back and look at the API, it tells us we can just copy and paste, and I'm missing the S. I need to put that back in. So, oh no, I did, HTTPS. So we want to set that as our URL. We're going to set two other options here. Again, we'll take our curl handler. We're going to set the return transfer to true, meaning we don't want to keep our user over on that URL. We need to get a response back. Our browser is going to stay on our current page. Also, going to set one more option, which is what type of request are we making? Are we making a GET? Are we making a POST? Again, if we look at the documentation, it tells us the method is POST. So we need to specify that in our options. Curl op post option. So these are just constants as part of the curl library. And we'll set our post equal to true. Just going to turn this off because it's getting in my way. So we've set up our request. The next thing we need to do is we need to set up an array that holds the two values we need to send. And again, if we look at the API, we need to send the secret and we need to send the response. So we have these in variables. We're going to put them in an array. We optionally can send our IP address. We won't bother doing that. I'm going to create an array, an empty array. We'll just call it post data. We'll put in our secret and our response. We need to call these column names secret and response because that's what our API expects. And now we're going to need to include our post data array as one of the curl options. We're going to call curl set opt one more time. And add our array of values. So we'll take our curl handler, and the option we want is the curl opt post fields. Now we pass in our data, which is our post data array. For putting each individual value, our key and our CAPTCHA response into variables, we're adding those to an array and passing that array as our list of post fields in our curl handler. Now we need to execute the request. And we will store what we get back from the API in a variable called result. So to run it, we will call curl exec, execute the curl request. And there's our curl handler. So when line 51 runs, we will actually make the call to the Google API and we will get back a JSON object. So our result variable, rather than being a single value, it's going to be an object that looks like this. We'll have a success key with true or false. And if we have a false response, we're going to have error code values as well. Now we can close the curl handler. And now we need to parse this response. We have a JSON object, but we have several different values in here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to convert the response object from a JSON object to an array so we can read it. I'll create a result array. And PHP, like just about every other programming language, has a built-in function that will allow us to read or deserialize JSON. Actually, has a good descriptive name, which is JSON_decode. And as you can imagine, we have an opposite function called JSON encode. If we format an array properly, we can encode it as JSON. We'll take our result array and set it to true. So now the last thing we need to do is check the success value. Our array is true or false. We'll look at our result array and the column called success. That's in lowercase. If it's equal to false, then we didn't get a proper Recaptcha response. Say, are you human? And we better set our OK variable to false. So meaning the user did not complete, we didn't get a proper CAPTCHA response. So let's try this and see what happens. I'm going to upload my save page. I'm working online for this activity. So now if I just refresh my form, I'm going to leave this box out, and now when I submit, okay, we'll need to fix that. It did still say that we're human. We got a warning here on line 40. Whoops, because I missed curl option URL. That's a constant, an enumerated value. We'll save and refresh. So when I don't fill out the code, this is what I get. We can see some of the other error codes. Let's say, for example, I put in an invalid key. I'll just put in another number there in front of my secret key. You don't have to do this. Just want to show you what kind of response we'll get. If we do the same, again, it knows without that key that something's wrong. So now I'll fix it up. I'm going to try and register one more time. Probably help if I filled out the CAPTCHA code. So I check this time I'm not a robot. Now it tells me my registration was saved. If I want to check that, I can now try and log in. And yes, I'm logged in, and in fact, my account was saved. Okay. So we've used CURL to make a hidden post to Google. We get back a JSON object. We parse that looking for a success value, and that tells us whether our user has successfully completed the CAPTCHA. That completes this activity.